Hey everyone, in this video I'll talk about a side project I've been working on recently to scrape and collect game logs from Terraforming Mars games played on the website Board Game Arena. And I'll also get into some fun statistics for corporation win rates and stuff like that I know you all love. Now there have been similar efforts to collect games from the Steam implementation of the game, but no one has really tried to do this at scale on BGA yet, as far as I'm aware, at least not for Terraforming Mars, which is honestly kind of understandable because it's pretty annoying to get the games. I'm gonna assume that most of you are familiar with BGA and Terraforming Mars implementation over there. My scraping efforts have focused mostly on season 21 of the Arena League that was recently finished. It ran from April to July and was won by Kulik, so congrats to him. Now this became quite popular because of the introduction of two-player base plus prelude, which is probably the most popular format among competitive players. And we can see that almost 100,000 games were played over those months. So the way that I'm collecting these games is I've made a simple command line tool in Python that opens a Chrome web browser, logs into BGA, clicks around and looks for replays and downloads those replays and gets the game data. Now you won't actually see the Chrome browser because this is running in so-called headless mode, but that's the gist of it. Once we've scraped the replay page of a game, we get a big JSON file that looks something like this. And here we have lots of information about the game. We have like the duration, the date the game was played, who was the winner. This game was won by a very mysterious player known as Corvus Mortis, who played Ecoline in 1 in 10 Generations. And we can see what cards they played and milestones and awards and so on they won. We can also look at every single move and see what happened, and we can also see the game state for each move, like the player trackers, how many tags and resources and so on did they have after each single move. And if we scroll a bit further down, we can also see what cards they've played. So here we see that Corvus Mortis has -1 VP because he played Flooding. There are also some other data we can look at, like parameter progression per generation and per move and so on, and some metadata at the end. But yeah, that's about it. The only problem with this approach is that BGA enforces a limit for how many game replays each account can access per day. So if I try to look at a game replay right now, you see I've reached the limit and the game log won't actually appear. And to be more specific, this limit is 200 games, which means that one account can scrape a decent amount of games over time, but not as many as I'd like. And because of that, I'm trying to adapt my tool into something that can be used by more people than just me, and I'm open sourcing all of the code on GitHub, so you can check that out. I'll put a link in the description. But the idea is to have a centralized registry of games and let people scrape games that haven't been scraped yet, so we can collaborate to collect a large number of games over time. This registry is very much a work in progress. I'm showing you an early version of the database right here, where I've collected a list of all the Terraforming Mars players on BGA, about 40,000 in total. And here I'll also want to collect an index of all the games so that we can use this to assign scraping tasks to those of you who want to contribute to building out this data set. Okay, let's look at some actual statistics, which I guess is what most of you came here for. The current data set is 2,122 games. Not a huge sample size, but it's starting to resemble something. As mentioned, all of these games have been collected from the Arena Season 21, and all of the games have the same game mode, two-player base plus prelude with the Tharsis map, and you can see the average and median ELOs in the dataset here. And the reason these values are quite high is that I've selectively scraped games that included players that were at the top of the arena standings. They also include their opponents, so they also include some weaker players, but the rating is heavily skewed towards stronger players. And we can even look at the distributions here for my index of all the players. That's the histogram on the left, and you can see that the rating distribution on BGA is kind of funny because you start out at 0 elo. And fun fact, like behind the scenes, BGA actually treats this as 1300, but for some reason they detract 1300 from the actual rating to the elo that's displayed to users. So like 800 is really 2100 and so on, but it doesn't really matter. You start out at 0, you'll see a lot of players at 0, but then once you surpass 100, you can never go under 100 again. That's why you see like there's almost 10,000 players out of 40,000 with a rating of exactly 100. And then there's a pretty heavy long tail on this distribution. So once you get into the like 500s and 600s, there are just very few players compared to the rest. On the other hand, if you look at the distribution on the right, that's the elo of the players in our data set, and that's totally different. So the most common rating is right around 700, which is a typical rating for players on top of the arena standings. Then you see there are quite a few players all the way down to 100. Usually the strongest players will filter so that they only face like elite and platinum players, but towards the end of the season it's relatively easy to get to platinum or even elite, so you'll find many relatively at least weaker players there. And full disclosure, I'm not a top player myself. I'm not the worst, but also not among the best, so just keep that in mind when I'm analyzing these stats. And the second disclosure before I forget about it, this dataset is not tiny, but it's not huge either. So some of the results I'll be showing you should be taken with a grain of salt, considering the relatively small sample size. But let's dive into some actual numbers. In this table, I have statistics about the performance of all the corporations, and I've sorted this by win rate. And we can see that Ecoline is on top by actually a pretty good margin. So 60% win rate is quite significant. I should also note that Ecoline has the highest average elo when played in this dataset. So it's preferred by strong players, which will naturally tend to boost the win rate. You can always ask yourself, does it have a high win rate because of the high average elo or vice versa? And I think the answer to that question is it's a little bit of both effects. Now, one thing I think that's particularly interesting to look at is the average elo gain. And we see that there are quite a few differences here. If I sort by this column, we see that Ecoline is no longer on top actually. So Value Trust and Terraforming Mars have actually higher expected elo gains than Ecoline, despite having lower win rates. And in particular, I think we saw like Credit Core surprisingly hardly gains any elo at all, despite having a pretty good win rate. So that's interesting. I'll get back to that later and try to explain how that can happen. So Phobolog is pretty much at the bottom no matter how you look at it. It's actually played quite a bit more often than corporations like Forgate and UNMI, which are second and third worst. And yeah, so Phobolog is, I guess, kind of a noob trap. It has a lowest average elo as well. Farsis, another one that seems to be kind of a noob trap, like low average elo, poor win rate, but played quite often. But to really make sense of these numbers, I think it helps a lot to look at the actual distributions of the elo gains for each corporation. And if we start on top with Ecoline, this is what it looks like. So what are the interesting buckets to look at, the interesting parts of this histogram when analyzing the performance of a corporation. As mentioned, when the rating gain or loss is right around 10 points, those are relatively evenly matched games. So you'll find these games in these areas here. Whereas if you have a very big upset, like the winning player has a rating that's at least 200 rating points lower than the player they just beat, they will gain more than 15 rating points. So these are big upsets with Ecoline, and these are big losses with Ecoline against much weaker players. This area represents games where the heavy underdog lost, and it doesn't actually happen that often. Here you have games where the big favorite won, and that you can see happens quite often. And the reason these green columns here are much higher than the ones on the left is generally because stronger players pick Ecoline more often than weaker players, and they also like almost never lose with it against much weaker players. Like there are only very few games over here where they had bad losses. So like what can we say about Ecoline? It's used a lot by strong players to beat up weaker players. Sometimes causes big upsets, so it's generally a corporation that's good for everyone, I would say. And it's also just really solid. So that's the reason why it has the highest win rate. So if you look at Valley Trust, which has the second highest win rate in the data set, already we can see that the histogram is a little bit different. It's more spread out, I would say. So there's a relatively high concentration of big upsets and some pretty bad losses compared to the normal results. And this is probably because this corporation has a relatively high ceiling and low floor. So it's a corporation that can high roll quite well with powerful engine strategies, and sometimes weaker players can stumble into those strategies and beat much stronger opponents. An interesting thing to notice is that Valley Trust, despite having a lower win rate than Ecoline, actually has a higher average ELO gain of 0.98, which is the highest of any corporation in the dataset. And again, I think this comes back to the number of upsets this causes compared to the lower frequency of bad losses. Moving on to interplanetary cinematics, the first thing you might notice here is this outlier on the right, and you might be asking yourself, I just said you couldn't gain more than 20 rating points per game, but when you have very few games in the beginning, your K factor is higher, so then you can actually gain more than 20 rating points in a single game. That explains that. But as for IC itself, it's a relatively solid corporation, it looks like. Most of the distribution is concentrated around the center. It doesn't have as many upsets as something like Valley Trust, but it's also just a really solid corporation. If you look at the range where you find evenly matched players, you see that it wins more often than not. I mean, this is famously the corporation with the highest starting capital, and I think strong players know when to pick it and when not to. Point Luna is another one that can high roll quite effectively, and you see, particularly notice this bucket here between 12 and 14 rating points gained. Like when you get up to 15 rating points gained, that means you beat someone that was rated 200 points higher than you. So Point Luna is certainly a very scary corporation to face when you're a strong player playing against an underdog, because you can potentially lose a lot of rating points. It's also swingy, loses some pretty bad games, but on average, it's one of the best. Another very strong corporation is Terraforming Mars, and all of the corporations I mentioned so far, maybe except for Ecoline, have almost the same win rate, and this one has the second highest average ELO gain after Valley Trust. also higher than Ecoline. And the histogram is kind of interesting. Thing I notice here is that in evenly matched games, Chongqing absolutely crushes, like it hardly ever loses. It's kind of interesting. There are some pretty bad outliers here, but that could also just be like statistical noise because the data set is relatively small. So this corporation might actually improve once we collect more games, we'll see. But anyway, it's just like really, really solid. Credicore is an especially interesting one, often regarded as one of the top corporations. It does have a win rate of almost 54%, so that's good, but it also has an average ELO gain of right around 0. So how can that be? Well, we see that it's often played by very strong players, and they do tend to win very often against much weaker players. But when they face like evenly matched players, it's maybe not the powerhouse I would have expected. It's more like 50-50 here, and actually it does quite often lose like between, what is this, 4 and 8 rating points. So slightly weaker players struggle with these corporations when they face stronger players, let's just say. And I think this is maybe because it's more of a like skill-based corporation. You won't necessarily high roll into an upset with this one. You need to do the heavy lifting yourself by utilizing the effect, playing SP greeneries and cities and so on. So it's maybe more of a skill-based corporation. Vitor, another Prelude corporation. We're seeing most of them at the top here. This one is also notorious for being able to build like just ridiculous engine setups and causing big upsets. We're maybe not seeing that as much as I would have expected here, but it is fairly spread out and we have some relatively big upsets here. Robinson Industries is the weakest of the Prelude corporations. That's no surprise to anyone. It's a little surprising to me still that this is like an average corporation. I would have expected it to be maybe in the lower half. But this one sits right around the average with 50% and 0 ELO gain. It seems pretty solid, like it's usually picked by stronger players. And they almost never lose against much weaker players, and it also causes some upsets. So overall seems pretty solid, mostly concentrated around the middle, so it's like average. Tractor is also very much average in its stats. It's a bit more swingy than Robinson, more spread out, kind of unexpected maybe. I've always thought of this as one of the stronger corporations, but maybe it's not as great as I thought. Now we get into the corporations that lose more often than they win, and the first one out is Mining Guild. Now Mining Guild does have an average ELO gain of 0, so it's not all that bad, and I think the saving grace for Mining Guild is that it has a relatively high ceiling, so it does score quite a few upsets here, and I think we've all faced Mining Guild players who had like 15 steel prod and just absolutely cruised to a victory, so we know what that looks like. But yeah, it's often not that great, it seems like. Saturn Systems is another one that has a lower win rate, but not as bad of an ELO gain, around 0. And it does cause some upsets, but like the most common result by far is losing between 0 and 2 rating points, which means that their opponents in these games were outrating them by like more than 400 points. So we're talking players in the 100s and 200s, and I think we all know like these players, they love to play Saturn Systems and hunt for Jovians, and usually that doesn't really turn out the way they hope, but when they hit like 3 or 4 multipliers, sometimes they can cause big upsets. And now we get into the bottom tier of corporations. They're just like clearly worse than the rest, and the first one out is Helion. It has a win rate of only 42% and an average elo gain of minus 1.5 points, which is actually the second worst in this data set. I would probably nominate this corporation for being like the most overrated by strong players, because strong players pick it relatively often, but they don't do all that well with it. Like, they very often lose to players of the same rating strength and also quite often to weaker players. So just my hot take, maybe this heat-based corporation is not all that. What can we say about Inventrix? It has pretty bad stats. It seems like it's quite often picked by like intermediate, semi-strong players who then proceed to lose against stronger players with it. But when strong players pick it, they usually win. And by the way, I was messaging Kulik, who won the arena season, and he actually had, I believe it was 11 out of 12 wins with Inventrix, which was one of his better corporations. So it just goes to show that, like, if you're good enough to know when to pick this, it's not all that bad, probably. And now we have everyone's favorite, Tharsis Republic. So Tharsis has a win rate below 40%, and you might ask how? Because isn't this corporation known to be quite good on the Tharsis map? Well, first of all, these games were two-player games, which severely limits the usefulness of the Tharsis effect. It really thrives when there are multiple players. But second of all, like, this is just an absolute favorite among the weakest players. They pick it very often, and that's why you see, despite the low win rate, the average elo gain is not that bad. So this doesn't necessarily mean that the corporation is bad as such. It's just that it's picked very often by weak players and naturally has a low win rate because of that. So it's like the classic noob trap, I would say. It's weak players pick it probably way too often. UNMI, again, pretty bad. This is actually the least picked corporation of all in this dataset, with only 86 games. And it also has the lowest average elo at 445. And you see this big red column here. This is the weakest players that have picked it and lost against the strongest players. They pick it more often, maybe because they just don't know any better. Not much else to say. Like, this corporation generally needs help to be any good. It needs consistent terraforming, and there are very often better alternatives. And now we get to the most depressing chart we'll be looking at today, Forgate. I mean, just look at this. If you look in the upper left corner, we'll see that the maximum elo gained in a single game was 9. Which means that out of the more than 2,000 games we collected, Forgate didn't beat a higher rated opponent even a single time. Like, can you imagine? Yeah, high rated players will sometimes scrape by wins just like on pure skill, but this corporation doesn't give you any help. It's just like a real stinker. And finally, we get to the bottom of the standings. The poorest performing corporation in this dataset is Phobolog. Whether you look at win rate or average elo gain, this one is at the bottom by quite a big margin. So it's clearly the worst corporation. I guess one saving grace is that it does score some upsets sometimes, unlike Forgate. So weaker players can get, I guess, lucky with it. And it even happened to me one day. I was playing against a very inexperienced player who just played Advanced Alloys and IO Mining Industries against me Gen 1 and proceeded to play like a bajillion Joves, including all multipliers, and then there's maybe not that much you can do. So it can be good, it's just very rarely the case. It's picked 144 times, which is quite a bit more often than Forgate and UNMI, so I think weaker players severely overestimate this corporation, or let's say underestimate how bad it is, because it's really like clearly the worst. That about wraps things up. I think I've been yapping for long enough. I have a lot more interesting statistics I could show you, like prelude win rates and milestones and awards and so on, but that'll have to be in other videos. I think the most important thing going forward is that I will try to increase the sample size of the data sets so that we can present these stats with more confidence. And as I mentioned, I'm working on a tool that will allow more of a collaborative scraping project where multiple people can contribute. And if you want to participate in that, just let me know. It's not ready quite yet, but hopefully sometime in the coming weeks. And with that, hope you enjoyed the video and see you around.